Hey guys, it's your boy Andre Adams. On this next episode of the NASM Peak Physique Podcast, we're going to break down foods that sabotage your physique goals. Abs are made in the kitchen, but they're constantly ruined by bloat. On this episode, I'm sharing my HTMA mineral balancing back tips to prep meals that reduce histamines, support digestion, and keep your core tight and crisp. Plus, we're going to talk about how herbs and minerals can help improve gut balance, GI distress, hormones, recovery, all that good stuff that you need to know in the world of bodybuilding and contest prep. No more bloated check-ins, just tight abs and tie-ins. Be sure to check out this episode and also make sure you like, subscribe, and follow us on YouTube.
You're listening to the Peak Physique Podcast with Andre Adams on the NASM Podcast Network.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the NASM Peak Physique Podcast. I'm your host, Andre Adams, NASM Master Trainer and IFBB Physique Olympian. Today's episode, we are going to break down some of the common foods that sabotage your physique goals and cause you to bloat. If you guys think back to a few months ago, we had, we'll call it part one of our Avoid the Bloat little mini series here. This is something I'd like to circle back to every few months because it's such a common issue that we run into in the sport of bodybuilding and dieting in general, right? Who hasn't been bloated? So again, with that, we're going to break down hidden ingredients and some common tips that will affect digestion and ultimately your stage readiness. Let's dive right in. We're going to start by talking about some of the most common culprits of bloating. If you guys are coaching athletes or if you're an athlete who's doing multiple preps, highly encourage you to do a digestive audit. Look for those common denominators, right? If you're coaching 20 athletes and everyone tends to get bloated when they eat uncooked broccoli, well, you want to look at those common denominators and figure out why that's causing people to bloat, right? So just keep that in mind as we're working through this episode. But so many good pieces of information. We're going to go off on a few little tangents here and there too, even on some HTMA mineral balancing that will directly improve your resilience against bloating. Some of the most common culprits would be things like sugar alcohols. So when we think about erythritol and sorbitol, you'll see these in a lot of protein bars. You'll see these, some of the artificial sweeteners and things like this. And if you've done, any type of bodybuilding before, especially going into peak week, that's why you'll commonly hear us pull out some of these artificial sweeteners that maybe you're okay earlier in prep if they're not causing a ton of GI distress. But again, when we're looking at specifically things to avoid, we want to look at some of those common culprits. So again, erythritol and sorbitol, beware of those. Emulsifiers, so soy, lecithin, right, polysorbate 80, some of those emulsifiers can also definitely cause some bloating and GI distress. And the ones when we're talking whole food specific, the things that I tend to see the most, I'll kind of delineate these into two categories, one being low FODMAP versus low histamine, right? So oftentimes you're unintentionally maybe having high FODMAP or high histamine foods in the diet. I'll give you some examples. So let's start with a high FODMAP. Those are going to be things that have a lot of fructose, sorbitol, dairy, wheat, cruciferous veggies, right? When we're thinking like broccoli, cauliflower, Brussels sprouts, gas-causing veggies that may be also too high in fiber. But in a nutshell, these are the type of carbs, veggies, meats, and things that tend to ferment in the gut, right? So when that type of bacteria is being produced, you can tend to get overgrowth and again, ultimately cause bloating or GI distress. And everyone's sensitivity is different. Even your own sensitivity can be different throughout time. You might start a prep perfectly fine, and then by the end of prep, some of those foods that were in your rotation are no longer tolerable for your gut, right? And we'll get into why that's the case with gut microbiome diversity and things like that, lack of variety in the diet. But right now, just specifically talking high and low FODMAP, fruits, veggies, carbs, specifically. The other one that we'll talk about, and I'll give some, exact examples of both of these, but high histamine foods and meal prep practices. So when we think about high histamine foods, those could be things like kimchi, miso, vinegar, sardines, Meats, we're going to go back to our earlier conversation on meal prepping best practices. But the thing about meats, especially leftovers that have been in the refrigerator for longer than 24 hours, definitely going to build up a lot of histamines and bacteria. So it's microbial growth on the food, right? But again, shellfish, seafood, leftovers, kombucha, even eggs can be, high histamine at times. So if you have an intolerance to that, that could be your issue. And the same goes for foods like avocados. As delicious as they are, we all love us some eggs and avocados. You got to be careful. If you do have a histamine intolerance, try to identify what your triggers are. And that will come back into play when we talk about that, digestive audit later on today. But again, think about high FODMAP, think about high histamine foods, and then we're going to give you some potential solutions and alternatives to sub some of those things out, help you identify the triggers, and ultimately reduce the bloat. So other things that would fall into the same category under common culprits, we talked a little bit about artificial sweeteners, we talked about sugar alcohols, and when we talk about some of those, quote unquote health foods, there's things that maybe have clean macros, right? Protein bars, even cheaper protein powders, and things that nutritional wise, when we look at that nutrition chart on the back, it seems to align with our overall macro strategy. However, sometimes the devil is in the details, right? And if we have a lot of sugar alcohols in that protein bar, if we have a lot of artificial sweeteners that do cause bloating, things like sorbitol and erythritol, this again can take something that traditionally is looked at as being a clean or healthy food and make it unusable for the physique athlete if it's causing a lot of undue GI distress. Other things that we're probably thinking about less that I want you guys to start thinking about at home. Let's say that we eliminate all these, right? We're focusing on low histamine foods. We're doing all low FODMAP incorporation, trying to get rid of any of the obvious triggers, and you're still having bloating. Could be an HTMA mineral imbalance. However, it could be something as simple as a lot of the things that slow gastric emptying, right? That are common practice in bodybuilding. We're talking about berberine. We're talking about GDA, glucose disposal agents, metformin, GLP and dual GLP-1 type supplements like the Ozempic, tirzepatide, retatrutide, right? All of these things slow gastric emptying. And when we slow gastric emptying, again, if you already have issues with gut health and you already have gas and bloating or you're highly sensitive, this could also exacerbate those issues. So, simple things like if it's an oral supplementation, again, we'll just classify the GDA, berberine, metformin all into kind of one bucket. You could try playing around with the dosage, cutting the dosage in half, spacing out the timing, or removing it or pausing it altogether. Obviously, we keep these things in for various reasons, from weight loss to controlling and regulating blood sugar. But, if you're taking it for bodybuilding purposes, physique purposes, and not medical purposes, then you can definitely play around with the dosage. Now, if you're, taking it as a prescription from your medical doctor, different issue. Listen to your medical doctor, but let them know what's going on if you do tend to get highly bloated. So keep that in mind. And again, the next one, when we're talking gastric emptying specifically, another one that's not so common, but I want to point out, would be high cortisol, high stress. So some people are aware of the brain-gut axis, right? We've got a lot of hormone axes in our body, HPA, we've got HPO, we've got HPG, all these things. But when we're talking about the brain-gut axis specifically, our mood, our anxiety directly impacts our ability to digest food, right? So if we're highly stressed, we're in a high cortisol state, sympathetic nervous system, that's fight or flight, guess what? Our blood is not going to our stomach to digest our food, right? And the energy in our body is a little different, right? It's trying to protect and preserve and hold. And so this can, again, slow down gastric emptying, definitely cause you some indigestion issues. So, there's different things that we would use to remediate that. Maybe it's supplementation like L-theanine, ashwagandha, GABA, 5-HTP, things that will calm your body down, right? Calm your central nervous system and your adrenals down. Regulate your diurnal patterns and your cortisol patterns. It could be red light therapy to shock your parasympathetic, right? The rest and digest part of your nervous system. So that's another conversation, but we need to be thinking about it because it's not always as easy as looking at the diet. A lot of times it's other factors in our lifestyle that are causing the bloating and the indigestion. Why does all this stuff matter for bodybuilding? Well, the main reasons that we care about it for bodybuilding, for one, who wants to be bloated all day, right? No one wants to be that bloated, gassy person, right? It's really uncomfortable for one. But when we think about it from a physique standpoint, water retention gives you a softer look on stage. And nobody wants to get on stage looking soft, right? This is bodybuilding. We want that hard, crisp, dialed physique, full, tight, round muscle bellies. We want that dry, that dryness look, right? That appearance of dryness to the skin. So little to no extracellular or subcutaneous water. So we definitely do not want inflammation, water retention. We don't want GI bloating, right? If we're holding food or water in the gut, or we're producing gas, things like this, it can distend the belly. Even for a smaller, petite bikini athlete, it might make it very challenging for her to have good core control and pull into her low abdominals, twist into that pose, show that good hourglass. So we want to make sure we do not have GI distress and, avoid the issues with absorption and inflammation when we're getting on stage. And, I touched on just briefly the impacts to posing, but this goes for anyone that's getting on stage. Core control is one of the most important things, in addition to posing, that you can possibly have on stage. And every single division in bodybuilding, what gives us the symmetry and that beautiful hourglass or X frame on stage? It's having a small, tight waist, right? So sure, we can build our lats and our shoulders and our glutes and our quads and try to exaggerate, this X frame. But if our waist is blown out because we're gassy all day and we're bloated and we're not digesting our food well, it's not going to be very aesthetically pleasing on stage. And you're certainly not going to perform at your best. Now, we've talked about the common culprits. We've talked about why this is important in bodybuilding. Let's talk about some solutions, right? So what do those solutions look like to help regulate or control bloating, and what can we do about it with our diet, supplements, and lifestyle? So first things we'll do, speaking from the coach's perspective, I like to have my athletes do a food log and also label awareness, right? So if they're taking supplements, maybe it's a pre-workout, maybe it's an artificial sweetener, right? Some sugar-free vanilla syrup that they're putting in their coffee. If they're starting to have these issues, you need to do a food log. It can even be a 24-hour recall, but also pay attention to food labels so that you can identify some of those known triggers that we just mentioned previously above. And with the food log too, I always like to start by asking more poignant questions. What time of day do you tend to feel your best? What time of day do you tend to feel the most bloated? After any particular meal, is there a particular meal that causes you to feel the most bloated? Maybe it's after meal 3 every single day. I tend to feel very full or very bloated and very uncomfortable. And so now we can start to get a little bit more specific in identifying what those possible triggers are. And then it's process of elimination. We're looking down that list of common culprits. We're looking for those, undercooked cruciferous vegetables like the broccolis, the cauliflowers, the Brussels sprouts. We're looking for those high histamine foods, the sardines and, shellfish and other things that might trigger a gut histamine response. So that's where we start with food log and awareness when we're thinking about it practically and putting this, into practice. Next thing when we're talking solutions is replace those known triggers. Let's take the high FODMAP example, right? Replace the high FODMAP sugar alcohol foods with low FODMAP options. A good example would be replacing broccoli, especially undercooked broccoli, with something like cucumber or summer squash or baby carrots, right? You could replace canned tuna with any lean cooked whitefish, right? That's going to have less of a histamine response in most individuals, especially if you're highly sensitive to histamines. There's also tests for these things too, and I'll elaborate a little bit more on where these things would show up in your HTMA, because we can certainly look at gut histamines and mineral ratios that would drive your ability to buffer those histamines, right? And digest your food. A good example of high histamine food swap for low histamine would be taking garlic and onion and replacing that with chives, right? Or taking avocado, replacing that with zucchini. So again, just making healthy food swaps and options and eliminating some of those known triggers. And it's pretty easy to do. If you guys are coaching, or if you're prepping yourself and you're really having trouble identifying why you're getting so bloated, try making some of these simple swaps for a few days and then journal it. Let's see, is it the same, better, or worse after day 3? And if you're starting to notice some improvement, you've now identified some of those triggers and you can avoid them. If you're still having issues, then we got to keep going, right? We've got to keep looking for other areas that could be impacting your ability to digest food, avoid histamines, and so forth. Another thing that we'll kind of pause on here, we've talked about it in the past with meal prepping, just reinforcing good meal prepping best practices. If you go back and watch the episode, there's 2 episodes. One was with one of my partners, Dr. Indigo Vasquez, aka Dr. Indy. We talk about meal prepping and making sure that we flash freeze any leftover foods. You can go ahead and cook your rice, cook your chicken and your vegetables, let it cool, but then immediately you should be freezing the bulk of that, and then only leave enough in the refrigerator to last you about 1 day or 24 hours. Definitely don't eat any of that food after day 3 if it's been in the refrigerator. It's pretty much a guaranteed bloat. If you think about even the basic stuff like rice, if we took white rice, rice is very dirty, right? It comes from the ground. So it's very dirty to begin with. It's very high amounts of bacterial growth. You should always wash your rice before you cook it. So that's one thing that I don't think a lot of people are aware of, is pre-washing their rice, cook it, and then store it. I think a lot of people's assumption is, well, it's carbohydrate, right? So it's not the same as a meat, right? I'm not going to get salmonella if it sits out. But the reality is rice is very dirty, and it doesn't take long for microbial growth and bacteria to be produced in that, right? So we need to make sure we're storing it properly, consuming it within, no more than 2 days if possible. And then you just pull out what you need from the freezer, or you cook fresh again. So keep that in mind. That could be one of the biggest triggers and causes of your bloating. And you'll know, right? If it's early in the week and you just meal prep, everything digested great on day 1, no issues. Day 2, you eat the same meals, you get a little bloated. Day 3, you eat the same meals again, and you get severely bloated. Normally, it's just a histamine response from microbial growth on your food. So let's eliminate the easy variables, optimize your meal prep strategies. And then another thing before we move on is just looking at diversity in your gut microbiome, right? We can add things like sodium butyrate to help encourage a healthy gut microbiome. But the easy thing to do is, we call it eat the rainbow, right? So we had a previous episode with my good friend and RD, Chris Tuttle, right? Another IFBB pro like myself. Shout out to Chris, one of the, I think the leads SME on our Meal Prep Made Easy course. And Chris and I broke down some of these strategies too, right? So again, just healthy meal prep best practices, encouraging a variety of different colors, fruits and veggies, different color of, even protein choices, right? We might need some lean red meats in low amounts. We might need some lean white fish, some eggs. We might need some chicken or some lean ground turkey. But whatever those proteins, those foods that tend to work best for your gut, make sure you have at least, I like to go at least 3 to 4 options for proteins, carbs, healthy fats, fibers, right? To, again, encourage healthy gut microbiome diversity. Otherwise, things could start out great early in prep, but you've only been eating chicken, rice, and asparagus for 12 weeks. And guess what? Now you've got an overgrowth of that particular strand of bacteria, and you still get bloating and other issues. So good meal prep and just dieting best practices to avoid the bloat. And there's some other things I'd love to share with you might not know about. Most of the times when we think about herbs and spices, for example, right? Who doesn't love herbs and spices? Nobody wants to eat their food plain. So we usually think about them for flavor, right? For flavoring our food and making it more enjoyable. However, I encourage you to actually reach out to me if you would like to after this episode, or just Google it, Chat GPT, whatever you got to do. Look for herbs and spices and the benefits, and you'll find some pretty handy guides out there. We've actually put one together for Team Adams, and we send this to all of our athletes. But I'm going to give you a few of my highlights here. We'll go my top 4 or 5. If I think about turmeric and ginger, right, often used again as spices when cooking, but there's some really good benefits when we talk about anti-bloat. So turmeric and ginger is a natural form of liver detox. inflammatory modulator, digestive support. Cinnamon. I know you guys out there love cinnamon. We put cinnamon on all of our desserts and treats. Some people put it in their teas and coffees. Cinnamon is actually excellent for blood sugar control. So we talked about maybe pulling back on some of your things like metformin, berberine, GLPs. If you're not using it for medical reasons, this could be a good alternative, right? Focus on adding in cinnamon into your diet and helping to stabilize your blood sugars. Plus, it's delicious. Who doesn't want cinnamon on their oats, right? Oregano. Oregano is another great one. I actually love oregano on a lot of my meats and, other foods. And my cheat meals, I'll be honest, my cheat meals, just so you guys know, it's usually a foot-long tuna sub. That's my jam. I always get heavy amounts of oregano on it. It's actually got an antimicrobial benefit and improves gut health. Think about that for a minute. We just talked about meal prepping and, microbes starting to reproduce and grow on our food. Well, if you season it with oregano, you might be neutralizing some of that microbial growth. So think about working in a little bit of oregano into your diet and your meal prep. And another one that I found very interesting that I'll share with you guys is fennel seed. So fennel seed actually is great for bloat reduction and estrogen detox support, right? So if we have excessive amounts of estrogen and bloating, fennel seed is a great way to inhibit those effects. So think about, practical use for fennel seed in some of your meal prep. With that, we're going to shift gears a little bit here. I want to talk about something and this comes from personal experience. This actually was revealed on my own HTMA. You guys have probably watched my episodes with Dr. Indy and I, where we break down fast and slow metabolic oxidation types. And then we actually used myself as the example, as last year a fast oxidizer, this year actually shifting closer into mixed fast oxidation. So we're always trying to push fast and slow oxidizers towards the middle, right, into mixed oxidation. And one thing that we discovered is, I was starting to have some of these issues we're talking about here today. And I'm like, all right, let's eliminate all the variables, right? So all low FODMAP veggies, avoiding any histamine triggers, digestive bitters in the morning, digestive enzymes with each meal to make sure we're breaking down protein, carbs, and fats. I'm checking all the boxes, right? I got my hydration and electrolytes on point. And I was chronically bloated for about 6 to 7 weeks there earlier this year. And we did an updated HTMA. And what that HTMA mineral report showed was a deficiency in phosphorus. And this one was new to me. Indy was very familiar with this. So shout out to Indy for helping me work through this. But the first thing she pointed out, she says, Andre, your phosphorus is way too low. And I'm going to break down for you guys why this is important for us physique athletes when we talk about protein digestion. And protein being obviously one of the most important macronutrients for bodybuilders, right? All right, so let's define this. Phosphorus is essential for hydrochloric acid, right? Production. So we'll call it HCl, right? And that's stomach acid for you guys that aren't aware of it. But proper stomach acid is critical to breaking down proteins into usable amino acids. So very high level, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to put 2 and 2 together. Well, if I'm deficient in phosphorus, I'm not producing enough hydrochloric acid in the gut, and I'm not going to be able to efficiently break down my proteins. So if you're not breaking down those proteins in your gut, what happens? Well, they're going to sit there. They're going to not be fully digested. It might cause some gas, some issues, and slowing of the digestive motility in general. So low phosphorus levels contribute to low stomach acid and incomplete protein digestion. Again, net result of that is bloating, gas, nutrient malabsorption. So you're also maybe not getting the full benefit where we're, taking the protein, breaking it down into amino acid form and driving muscle protein synthesis. Instead, we're just getting gas, and that partially digested food is passing through us without us really getting the benefit of it, right? And again, this is actually, when we talk about low phosphorus levels, that condition is especially important with, zinc, iron, and B12. So if those are deficient too, we can really get some incomplete protein digestion. Now, this is especially relevant for athletes on high protein diets, which is most of us, not all of us, right? We had our episode with Dr. George Farah, and he told the story about how he had one kidney and had a very low protein diet. even competing and qualifying for the Olympia. So we're not always on a high protein diet, but 90% of athletes will have higher protein intake to support lean body mass than the average adult, right? So again, in that scenario, under those conditions, if we have poor stomach acid, we're going to have wasted macros. We're not going to progress our physiques as efficiently as possible. And on top of all that, we get the blast, the bloating and gas, and we get the GI distress. So phosphorus specifically, right? Phosphorus activates the digestive enzyme systems. This also works synergistically with B vitamins and magnesium to convert enzymes into their active forms. These enzymes, like pepsin in the stomach and trypsin in the small intestine, help break down those proteins into absorbable peptides. So again, when we're talking like micronutrients, you can now see how they all interplay, right? So if we don't have some of these micronutrients and B vitamins and magnesium in the proper ratios, we're not able to digest our food. Our bodies are pretty complex. And before we go deeper with phosphorus, I want to throw another footnote in there because this relates to this digestive process, and it relates to the anti-histamine, right? When we think about gut histamine specific, another thing that we can do to be proactive is actually adding in more vitamin B6. B6 helps our bodies produce an enzyme called DAO enzyme, which helps inhibit that gut histamine response. So think about that as we're always also talking about phosphorus here. Now, phosphorus, it can be defined also as a structural component of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. You NASM gurus out there would be very familiar, especially if you've taken our nutrition courses and you understand energy production systems, right? But digestive organs, even like the stomach, pancreas, small intestine, also need ATP energy. We normally think about it for moving weights and explosive movements, energy production. But again, some of our organs at the cellular level also use ATP to produce enzymes, secrete acids, and move food through the tract, right? Low phosphorus equals less ATP. That's going to, again, have a slowing effect or a weakening effect on the total digestive system. So we got to be very careful of that. Indirect benefit is better phosphorus means better calcium balance too. So if you guys have heard us talk about calcium shell in the past, when it relates to mineral balancing, this is a stress response. Calcium and magnesium shell are both stress response. This is where some of those minerals actually migrate from our hard tissues like bone mass into our soft tissue like skin, hair, and nails. So when we think about calcium and phosphorus working in a ratio, too much calcium, aka calcium shell, can slow digestion. It's a defense mechanism, a buffer, right? So that's going to slow digestion and blunt enzyme output, increase a lot of that gut histamine response or that bloat response. So looking at rebalancing with more phosphorus helps unlock metabolism and improve digestion and efficiency. Things to look out for if you guys are still having bloat problems and you're interested in doing a mineral test, for example, to look at calcium, magnesium, phosphorus. Low phosphorus on an HTMA is often paired with high calcium. And again, we're not talking about, you're supplementing with calcium and your blood serum levels are high. We're talking about high HTMA. So, the amount that's in your soft tissue is high. So low phosphorus paired with high calcium in the soft tissue and slow oxidation. When we have that condition, typically you're going to have trouble breaking down your food. You're going to have trouble digesting proteins. And other symptoms might include even fatigue after protein meals, because again, it consumes a lot of energy and it can make you feel lethargic or sluggish, right? Low appetite, trouble gaining lean mass despite your high protein intake because you're just not breaking down those amino acids and peptides into usable forms, right? So make sure that you look at the full picture. Don't just look at whole foods. Don't just look at lifestyle factors or supplements or medications. We also got to look deeper into the root cause of what could be driving some of these issues with things like our mineral balancing and just really optimizing the full spectrum of our digestive system. Final takeaways that we'll recap here for you guys today as we're talking about avoiding the bloat and some of those common culprits and triggers is knowing what's in your food. This is where that food audit might come into play. Make sure you share that with coach, but you should also be informed. If you're unsure, turn that energy drink over, look at the nutrition label, look for those common culprits. Take that protein bar and take a look at the nutrition label. See how many natural ingredients are in there. See how many of these potential triggers might be in there. And again, just logging times of day, specific meals or foods, and then trying some of those low histamine, low FODMAP food swap options and seeing if it's the same, better, or worse over time. Definitely going to help you get a little bit smarter, avoiding a lot of this GI distress. And then respect your digestion the same way we do our training, by prioritizing GI health and digestive motility through micronutrients, meal prep best practices, and daily monitoring. Guys, that's all I have for you on this episode today. I hope that you apply these principles and you can start to prep a little more effectively and hopefully more comfortably, right? No one wants to be bloated on prep. If you guys have follow-up information or you have questions for me, you can find me online at andreadamsofficial.com or teamadamsprep.com. You're more than welcome to email me any questions or suggestions for subsequent episodes too at trainingbydre@gmail.com. And you can find me on Instagram and YouTube at andreadams_official. And again, if you take anything away from this episode, if you learned something new today, or you just enjoy coming here with your boy and chopping it up, make sure you share this episode with at least one friend. We truly appreciate your support here on the NASM network, and we will see you guys next time on the Peak Physique Podcast.